Hi, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you all. I'd like to talk to you today about the opportunity that lies before people who are engaging in fresh expressions of the church to have a fresh approach to telling our story, to telling the biblical story. And I'd like to think about this with you as creating a story space instead of a storyline. Now, look, while we've been arguing about all kinds of things over the last several decades, the conversation outside the church has shifted. Instead of people asking, when do I go to heaven, or how do I go to heaven when I die, or where can I go to experience God, or how can I be happy and successful while I'm alive, or how can I be part of the one true best religion, or how can I be forgiven from sin, I think more and more people are asking a different set of questions. For example, some are asking, how can humanity avoid self-destruction through climate change and ecological overshoot? People are asking, how can I experience God or life or meaning, not in this or that church or this or that religion, but wherever I go? How can I stay sane in a world that's falling apart? How can I hold any group identity without harming other group identities? How can I live by a story that is honest and life-giving? And if we had time, we could talk about the reasons why I think there's a shift in the kinds of questions we're asking. But largely it's because of the ways that old stories have been and are being discredited, not by the secular world, but more by the people who hold those stories. But that's a conversation for another time. I think it's time for us to peel the onion, to get to the deepest questions that we can. What true story can we tell that meets the need of humanity going forward? And how do we speak of God in that story? I believe there are promising answers to those deeper questions. And in our brief time together, I would like to offer you two different approaches. First, I'd like us to try to look at our current understanding of the biblical narrative. This is from a book I wrote some years ago called A New Kind of Christianity. A lot of us inherited a storyline for the Bible that looks like this. Now, some of you right away can fill in the blanks here. This is the story of a perfect Eden, something called the fall. Some would call it the ontological fall into a new state of existence, a fallen history, a fallen world where all people are depraved and headed for eternal conscious torment in hell, unless they experience salvation so they can go to a new perfect state after death called heaven. When I was a pastor, I began to have questions about that telling of the story, mostly because I preached every week from the Bible. And I realized that I never, ever, ever in a million years would have interpreted the Bible to tell me this 6-line story. I started to realize that I think this was more the story of Plato's cave than it was the actual story of the Bible. It was the story of a Platonic ideal and then a descent of people into the Aristotelian real, where they wanted to somehow avoid Hades and get back to that Platonic ideal. I believe the Roman Empire realized that this philosophy that had suited the Greek Empire so well also suited them very well. And in certain ways, that Neoplatonic story became the story of empire. And I believe many of the tragedies and problems we face in the Christian faith today, many of the deep doubts and questions many of us have about the Christian faith today, are not actually questions about the Christian faith. They're about a distortion or perversion or corruption of the Christian faith. It's so ironic. Many Christians are worried about syncretism, but I have deep suspicions that what we think of as historic Christianity is itself a syncretism with Greek philosophy and Roman politics. You might say, well, is there an alternative understanding of the biblical story? And I think to find that understanding, we have to realize that we tend to read the Bible backwards. In other words, when we try to see Jesus, we tend to see him through a sight line. Might start with Rick Warren or Billy Graham or Charles Finney or John Wesley or John Calvin to Luther, Aquinas, Augustine, Paul, Jesus. We don't realize that we have this set of lenses. And when we look back toward Jesus, we look back through the assumptions of Jesus' descendants. I think another way to, and by the way, I'm not against that. I just think if we're self-conscious, if we become conscious of that reality, it helps us realize there could be some serious problems. If the way of seeing Jesus was limited or narrowed or distorted, and that way kept being modified by later and later people, we could find ourselves quite far from the story that Jesus actually lived by and told himself. In order to understand Jesus and his story, I began to think that we need to go back and understand Jesus instead of in light of his descendants, to understand him in light of his ancestors. How would we, what story would Jesus be telling if he saw himself as being in the story of his mother Mary and his cousin John the Baptist? And if they saw themselves as being part of the story of Isaiah, and farther back the story of David, and farther back the story of Moses, and farther back the story of Abram and Sarah, and farther back the story of Adam and Eve. In other words, what would happen if we tried to resituate Jesus in his native environment? Not the environment of the centuries since he lived, but in the story that he inherited himself. And if we do that, there is no question that the primary narrative for Jesus as a Jew was the narrative of Exodus. Now, it really was the Black theologians and the liberation theologians who, in the last century, began to engage with this reality. They said, look, the meaning of a word like salvation does not arise in the context of beliefs about original sin or penal substitutionary atonement and so on. The meaning of the word salvation arises in the Bible in a very specific historical situation, the Exodus, the liberation from slavery. If you want to think of it this way, the story of Exodus is based on the audacious claim that the God of the universe, the ultimate reality, the presence in which the universe happens, is not the authority figure who legitimizes Pharaoh and other potentates. Rather, the God of the universe, when God sees the pyramidal structures of oppression and power, God is willing to disrupt those oppressive systems when he hears the groans and cries of the people at the bottom of the pyramid. Do you feel the audaciousness of that statement? And so the story of Exodus is first the story of liberation. And if you think the way ancient people thought, the book is structured first around 10 plagues. Those get the people, the slaves, out of Egypt. And then 10 commandments. Those get Egypt out of the slaves. Liberation and formation, external, political, economic, human liberation, and internal, personal, spiritual liberation and formation. Now, that is the primary biblical narrative. You can see why Black theologians, post-colonial theologians, theologians who grew up and were raised in a version of the biblical story that justified their oppression, you can see why they would take a second look and maybe help people like me, a descendant of the colonizers, to see the Bible in a fresh light. Now, you might say, well, hold it, the book of Exodus doesn't sit out there alone. You're right. I think there's another story that was very essential for the ancient Hebrew people. Into this story, Jesus knew he was born. And this was the story of creation, the story that begins in Genesis. Now, I'll leave this up to you to do your own Bible study. And I wouldn't expect any of you to agree with what I'm saying right away. But I'll tell you my experience as someone who read and preached the Bible week after week as a pastor for 24 years and has been a student of it all my life, really. I realized that if I were an innocent reader of the book of Genesis, I never would have come up with that story. I can see how later people could pick and choose verses from Genesis, but it wasn't what was really there in the story. And if you think of it this way, the story of Genesis is the story of God creating the earth, human beings messing up themselves in the earth, and God working to bring people back into liberation and harmony. In some ways, it's the prequel to the book of Exodus because it begins with the creation of the world and ends with the journey into Egypt where the people become slaves. Can you see how that's setting up the perfect prequel, episode 1 in front of Star Wars? And you might think of it like this. Creation is good. By the way, the word perfect was not a word in the discussion of creation. I would propose to you that Hebrew good is better than Greek perfect. Greek perfect is static and sterile. Hebrew good is dynamic and fertile and relational rather than domineering and controlling. And in this story, God creates a good and nonviolent world. Human beings don't want to live within the limitations of creation. They want to be able to act like gods themselves, be above any kind of moral limitation or constraint. And so what happens? They engage in violence. The first violence being the violence of fratricide, with Cain killing Abel. You read through the book of Genesis, and what happens at the end is that instead of a brother killing a brother, one brother was going to be killed by his brothers. Then they ended up selling him into slavery. And then he used his when he gained privilege and power, he used his privilege and power to save the lives of his brothers. It's a story of life-giving to life-taking to life-giving. A powerful prequel to the book of Exodus. But the book of Exodus isn't the end of the story. The people enter the promised land, and guess what they find out? It's not so great to be in a promised land of milk and honey when your neighbors don't have enough milk and honey, or they're too greedy for more milk and honey. And so they want to keep invading you and conquering you to take your milk and honey. And so what happens is among the prophets, a realization comes that having the promised land is not enough. They begin to dream of a promised time. And this is the story of Isaiah and the other prophets, where they begin to envision a peaceable kingdom, where swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, where people will not study war anymore and no one will make them afraid. Oh, the vision is so powerful and beautiful. People living in harmony with God, in harmony with each other, and in harmony with the earth. Now, you take these three primal stories, and I think these would have been the stories in which Jesus was shaped and in which his life and his story would take shape. And I'd like to propose to you, I don't mean this literally, I mean this as a metaphor. I mean this more poetically, that you think of these three biblical stories not as a two-dimensional storyline, but as a three-dimensional story space. From the Big Bang in the beginning, expanding out with creation, with liberation, with reconciliation, and you might say new creation. And this universe continues to expand. In this universe, there is such a thing as evil. To go against the flow of creation, to go against the flow of liberation, to go against the flow of reconciliation, that is what we mean by sin. But within this story space, there's room for a million kinds of good to develop and flourish and grow. And by the way, in that story, now let Jesus show up. Let him preach the Sermon on the Mount and perform healings and confront the religious hypocrites and confront the dominant powers of the Gentiles. In this context, look at the story of a man walking to Jerusalem, knowing what he will do and knowing what the Romans will do and the religious leaders will do. And in this story, to speak of cross, death, burial, resurrection as a powerful, powerful new meaning. So I'd like to propose to you that as you think about the story that you're going to be telling in this new context, that you give yourself permission to pop out of those old 2 dimensions and to live in 3 dimensions. Now, very briefly, I want to give you another way to think about this biblical story. And over the years, I've noticed that there are 6 framing stories that typically direct human societies. I should say, I originally started thinking about this because of the work of N.T. Wright on the Gospels. And as I thought about this through the years, it's just become richer and richer and richer. The primary story that we see in the Gospels and that we see in the headlines every day is the domination story, where a group of people say the only way to have peace and security is through controlling others and controlling the environment. What we call civilization is largely a domination story. If we were in charge, if our party was in charge, if our ideology was in charge, by the way, Christians play this, they're currently playing it in my country, this whole resurgence of Christian nationalism. It's just the old domination story with a Christian bumper sticker on the back. And it's all the idea of gaining power and being in control for us over them. Wherever you have the domination story, you also have the revolution story, where people who are oppressed on the bottom say, if we could just overthrow our oppressors, then we could be in control and we would then have peace and security. This, instead of us over them, it's us overthrowing them. So the domination and the revolution stories, you can see how they're just a vicious circle. What happens when you're in control and everything should be fine, but things aren't fine? Well, now we need to find somebody to blame for our problems. And so the only way back to peace and security, we think, is by naming, shaming, and blaming some minority. If those people would change or disappear. And I call this the purification story because its ultimate end is ethnic cleansing. Because this is the story that says all of our problems are because of those people. And if we could just get rid of them, we would be fine. Us excluding them. Then comes the victimization story. Peace and security through maintaining a defining memory of injustice and victimhood. What happens if I'm one of the people or part of the group that's being blamed and shamed, and I know what I'm being blamed for isn't true, but I don't have the power to have a revolution and nobody listens to me because I'm blamed and shamed? Then I can only try to survive by imagining a day when my oppressors would be brought to justice, when the majority would change. And in the meantime, I'll try to hang on and survive, us in spite of them. And then some people, when they're victims long enough, they say, we can't put up with this anymore. And they escape somehow. I happen to live in a country that tells this story in relation to your country. We were dominated by these other people and we escaped and we became free. The isolation story. We got away from those bad guys. We broke relations with them and we became the beacon of freedom. If only we could be left alone to be ourselves by ourselves, us apart from them. By the way, this is a very common story in religion. People split off. We're going to be the pure group. If we could just isolate from those polluted people, you can see how isolation and purification stories interplay with each other. Then the 6th story, when all else fails, make money, peace and security through accumulating weapons and wealth in a competitive world. If only we could buy, enjoy, and stockpile what we desire, and we would outcompete them. And through money, we would gain our liberation. Money and weapons. We would gain our liberation. And when you see these 6 stories interplaying, I'll tell you, suddenly the world starts to make sense. You start seeing this politician, this party, this religious group this nation is playing by this or this narrative, and it's helping them. It's their desperate attempt to get what they think they want and need. But of course, these stories consume each other and feed each other, and they just plunge us deeper and deeper into conflict. In the Gospels, you could say that the domination story is the story of the Romans, Caesar, and then his puppets like Pilate, and the Sadducees and the Herodians become the religious groups that play into this authoritarian playbook. And religions are always giving authoritarians camouflage and support in contemporary history as well as ancient history. The revolution story is clearly the story of the zealots. The purification story seems to be the story of the scribes and Pharisees, always obsessed with the guilt of some other group that they can, in a sense, project all of their own guilt and anxiety upon. The victimization story is the story of the Galilean peasants and the Samaritans and the outcasts and sinners who are looked down upon. The people, by the way, with whom Jesus spends most of his time, and it's so interesting to see how he works with the people in the victimization story. The isolation story is the story of the Essenes. We see it in reflected in John the Baptist, especially, but from extra biblical literature, we see it a lot in the Essenes. Then the accumulation story, the story of the rich Judean landowners, stewards, and temple elite. And we could see these stories at work in our world today. Us over them, us versus them, us in spite of them, us away from them, us outcompeting them. And Jesus comes along with a very different story. The story of the good news of the kingdom or empire or civilization of God. News, by the way, is a story. It's a news story. And it's a story, instead of violence and domination and revolution and all the rest, it's a story of peace and joy and reconciliation, living in harmony with God, with ourselves, with our neighbors, with the earth. And if there has ever been a time where our world needs an invitation to defect from the current dominant stories that are literally suicidal and leading us to self-destruction, this is it. Many of our existing churches are not prepared to tell this story. They're deeply, faithfully committed to not a transformation plan or a liberation plan. They're deeply committed to an evacuation plan, how to go to heaven and leave this world behind. But when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we do not pray an evacuation prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May we go to your kingdom when we die. We pray, may your kingdom come here on earth. May your kingdom, your new way of life, your new civilization, your new story. And Jesus invites us to follow him and become part of that beautiful, powerful story. Thank you very much.